Hello everybody. Welcome back to Zilog and Moto, the channel where I pretend games never advanced beyond the 16-bit era to make me feel good about the fact that I've yet to finish a single Yakuza game. Seriously, 50 hours into Yakuza 0 and I haven't made a freaking dent. Well, that's not completely true. It tells me I'm over 50% complete. So, if I'm lucky, I'll get to Yakuza 6 by 2030. I mentioned the Yakuza series, specifically Yakuza 0, not just for a silly introduction to this week's video, but because, like with Space Harrier in episode 62, it's the inspiration for the game I chose this week. In Yakuza 0, you can do lots of things just for fun that don't necessarily have anything to do with completing the game. You can go to an arcade and play picture-perfect versions of Space Harrier or Outrun, go to a bar and shoot pool or play darts, or bowl. I like to bowl in real life. I'm not necessarily very good at it. I usually average about 120, but it's fun, and any exercise I can do while drinking beer and not baking out in the hot sun is a win-win situation for me. Thankfully, by living in a major metropolitan area, I've got a few options nearby for places I can go if I want to mix things up a bit. And while the current health crisis has been going on, I've definitely missed being able to go out and roll a few. I was even considering buying my own shoes and ball before all this went down, and I'll be glad once it's truly safe to go back out to get back out there. So, this brings me back to bowling virtually. Yakuza 0's implementation of bowling isn't bad. It's challenging, but not to the point where you feel like it's impossible or the computer is cheating you out of knockdown 7 or 10 pins. Yakuza 0 certainly wasn't the first to do this. It's famously one of the side activities you can do with your cousin Roman in GTA 4, and 2 years previous to that, Nintendo revolutionized video game bowling with the sports inclusion in Wii Sports. However, if you notice something about all these games that I mentioned, bowling itself isn't the main focus of any of these titles. Well, it was for me in Wii Sports, as I pretty much didn't play any of the other 4 sports that were included, but the point remains that the title's called Wii Sports, not Wii Bowling. And over the years, there's not a ton of bowling-only video games that have been released for various home consoles. Case in point, if you combine the Master System, the Genesis, the Sega CD, and the 32X, the 4 consoles that are the focus of this channel, and have a total of almost 1,300 English-language games, there is only one bowling title, and I was actually shocked by that when I was doing research for this review. And that game is Championship Bowling for Genesis. Championship Bowling is the third and last game ever released by Mentrix Software in June of 1993. Not a ton of information is out there about the company, but they also released the US versions of Caliber 50 and Wardner in 1991. Visco had originally developed the game for release in Japan as Boogie Woogie Bowling, and they allowed Mentrix to release a US port of the game as they previously had with Wardner. However, Mentrix didn't just perform a straight English translation of the game this time, and instead they renamed the title to Championship Bowling. Americanized the characters, as they were originally very anime-esque, and included an alien-looking robot, and changed the main theme song, although they left the original theme in the game, and it can be played in the sound test menu. Oh, and due to a strange turn of events, Championship Bowling came out before Boogie Woogie Bowling, as Boogie Woogie Bowling was delayed in Japan until December of 1993 for some reason. So, did Mentrix Software go out on a high note with Championship Bowling? Or is the title just another sports game on a console filled with them? Well, we shall see, but first, a look at the package. And here's Championship Bowling. Of note first, the case is in fantastic condition. I mean, nearly perfect. I don't see any marks or scratches anywhere on the front, the spine, or the back. The hang tab at the top is still intact as well, and I always like to see that. The inner cover is in just as good a shape, with no discernible water or sun damage anywhere, and no odd wear at the top or bottom that sometimes happens when the inner cover slips out of place. Onto the contents of the cover itself, and I really like this cover. The pins flying everywhere, the bowling ball with a ghost trail behind it giving a sense of speed and action, and the monitor above the alley showing off the 3 most important elements of playing the game, the spin meter, the aim meter, and the power meter, and each of them more or less look like their in-game counterparts, or at least the visual styling of such. And the whole thing is angled, just giving it a cool look. Up above, the logo is decent, But they kind of screwed up the B in bowling. The trail on the ball is too dark, and it's hard to make out it's a B. But I like how the bowl is knocking down the W, the L, and the I. The cover art is very eye-catching. It would definitely stand out on a shelf. Flipping over to the back, and things definitely take a turn for the worse. The first problem is the rear cover is plain white. Just plain white. Yes, everything stands out because of that, but it doesn't look good, and in fact makes it look a bit cheap. I'm sure Mentrix was trying to cut costs by going with a simpler layout, but this isn't impressive at all. And the entire bottom third of the cover is completely wasted with the barcode, a Genesis logo, another copy of the Sega seal so you would know it was a properly licensed title, and then even more information about Mentrix to boot. Just a poor design altogether. Moving up to the rest of the cover, the B in bowling looks better, so I'm not sure what the issue was on the front. And there's an interesting revelation about the game that it supports 4 players. More on that later, but that is actually true. Down below, some cheap looking bowling clip art, some pretty normal color text describing the game, and then 3 small screenshots that look really rough. Seriously, I think these are some of the worst screenshots I've seen on a box in a while. Just blurry, poorly colored, and the edges are cropped out as well. Apparently 90% of the cover budget went toward the front, and 10% or less went toward the back. Opening up the case, and you'll see the cartridge is in near mint shape, similar to the outside. But the manual looks like it slipped out of place at some point, and got bunched up in the spine on the inside for an extended period of time. Although, other than that bend, it's well preserved. There's not a ton to the manual, as you might imagine due to it being a bowling game, but it does do a good job of explaining how to play the game and the various modes of play. An important note is at the bottom of page 3, where it explains how the 4-player system works, but it's not super clear. Essentially, if you have one controller, it gets passed around to all 4 players, but if you have 2 controllers, play rotates between controller 1 and controller 2, and that's a good system. One other quick thing I'll mention, I like how towards the end of the manual there's a section that has a short bios and pictures of each of the 4 characters in the game. It's a small detail, but it makes the game feel like it's had more thought put into it, and the bios do accurately describe the characters, so you can decide who to pick and what a game will be like when you're playing against a specific person. Okay, enough about all that, let's roll some balls. Bowling. A game anyone can play, but few have the dedication to really master. Probably because most of us are busy drinking beer and making fun of gutter balls than actually trying to get better at the game. But along with needing a certain level of dedication, you've got to have a certain amount of money too. Now, granted, usually playing any kind of organized sport comes with certain costs, but for many other sports, all you really need is a ball and a public court or field, and you're good to go to get some practice or scrimmage in. Bowling, on the other hand, requires you to go to an alley and rent a lane. Along with the lane, you'll need special shoes, a custom ball, and possibly some sort of hand-wrist brace for your bowling hand. Now, obviously, if you're just going for fun, the alley will supply the balls, and you can rent the shoes at a low cost, but you still gotta pay to go out and rent the lane. So, wouldn't it be nice to be able to bowl in your living room without having to deal with going out, getting dressed up, trying to figure out what alleys are potentially doing discounts, and then dealing with others at the alley when you get there? At least sometimes anyway, as there's no replacement for a true bowling alley experience. Well, that's what this week's game, Championship Bowling, tries to provide for Genesis users, a way to experience the fun of going bowling without having to leave the comfort of your couch. Championship Bowling offers a primary game mode of bowling a standard set of 10 frames in an attempt to get as close to the mythical 300-pin game as possible. You can either practice by bowling yourself, bowl with up to 3 of your friends in a 4-player mode that was not common at the time, as Championship Bowling was released prior to any 4-player controller adapters for the Genesis, or take on the computer in a direct matchup. Choosing to play against the computer starts a 12-match tournament, where to win, you must beat the computer 12 times in a row. Why 12 times? Well, as I mentioned earlier, the game features 4 bowlers for you to choose from, 2 men and 2 women. Each of the bowlers has specific strengths and weaknesses. For instance, some are stronger than others, so they're more comfortable with a heavier ball, while others are better at curving the ball. After picking a bowler, you then pick a size ball, and then you have to start competing against the other 3 bowlers one at a time. The game features 4 different bowling alleys to compete at, so once you've beaten all the computer bowlers at one alley, you move to the next to do it again, and at the next alley, and so on. Here's where perhaps the first flaw in the game exists, or maybe not a flaw, but a missing feature that would have helped. There's no system in the game, by way of either password save or battery backup, that would allow you to bowl a few games, stop and go do something else, and then come back to pick up where you left off. Games don't take very long to play, especially if you're doing well and bowling lots of strikes. I'd estimate about 10 minutes a game. But still, that means if you want to beat the game, you have to have at least 2 hours you can dedicate to the cause. And that's if you don't mess up and have a bad game or two, and have to replay them. This isn't a huge issue, but it's definitely something that would have been nice for the designers to think about when creating the game, especially since a password system would have been pretty easy to implement, as all of you really needed to keep up with the bowlers being used and the match you were on. Just a missed opportunity. Having the 4 different bowling alleys is nice, and each alley is different, providing some much needed variety to a game where you primarily just do the same thing over and over and over again. Each alley provides a different graphical backdrop of fans coming to watch the bowlers, and each alley has its own background theme music. I would have really preferred for the music to change every match, rather than have to hear the alley's music 3 matches in a row, but at least it's not the same background music all the time, no matter which alley, I guess. And as a bonus, and something that made me question my sanity the first time I saw it, the other 3 bowlers will wear a different colored outfit at each alley. And that in and of itself isn't a big deal, but their hair color changes as well. In my second match against Mark, he changed from a blonde to a brunette between alleys, and I couldn't figure out what was going on at first, until I took a closer look at the 2 women, Dana and Linda, and realized that they all changed, and Mark's switch was just a bit more dramatic. And I like this. It's a small thing, but it keeps things interesting. However, the most important difference between the bowling alleys isn't their background music, or how an opponent looks at a particular alley, or what the cheering fans look like. It's the style of the lane, specifically how the lanes are oiled. If you're not aware, the wood base of the lanes are frequently oiled to do 2 things. First, the oiling protects the wood from damage due to the actual activity of rolling heavy balls down the lanes, and secondly, the amount and location of the oil changes the behavior of a ball as it moves down the lane. Think of it like a pitcher throwing a spitball. The substance affects the rotation of the ball, but in reverse, as the more oil causes the ball to have less friction and move straighter, versus less oil allowing more contact and amplifying whatever spin is placed on the ball. I went through that long explanation because each of the 4 alleys' lanes is made up of 3 sections, and their oil pattern is different. One alley is well oiled, so it plays fast. The next is drier, so it plays slow. Then there's an alley where you can customize if each of the 3 sections plays fast or slow, and finally there's an alley where the lane changes at the computer's whim. Being able to account for these changes and adjust your approach and style is part of the game. And again, it keeps things interesting, where normally you could just do the same thing over and over with the same amount of success. Beyond the standard tournament gameplay mode, there's also 2 other gameplay modes, a spare mode and a bonus mode. The spare mode is fairly self-explanatory. For each frame, you're presented with a partial set of pins. Your goal is to knock down all the pins, making the spare. For every successful spare, you get 30 points. And if you fail, well, you get nothing. Bonus mode is a bit more interesting. It plays like a standard game, except each pin has a specific point value totaling 30. And the pin values change every frame. Also, if you get a strike, you get all 30 points plus a bonus 10. I like having these 2 extra modes, and spare mode is especially good for practicing certain scenarios. But, and what I can only consider another flaw and missed opportunity, is that these modes are only available for self-play or with another player. You can't take on the computer. I don't understand this at all, and it just seems lazy. It couldn't have been that hard to implement. The actual process of bowling is pretty straightforward and simple. First, you'll be given an arrow to move across the lane to indicate where your bowler will start from. Next, a meter will start moving back and forth from left to right, and you stop it to indicate how much and to which direction spin will be placed on your ball. And finally, a power meter pops up where you need to hit the C button to indicate how hard you'll bowl the ball. This all works extremely well, and usually if I don't hit a strike or miss a spare, I know it's only my poor reaction time to blame, and not an issue with the game itself. I like the fact that the controls are relatively simple. I think that if they tried to do too much here, it would have just made things overly complicated and ruined the fun. Championship Bowling is only a 4 megabit cart, which is pretty small by mid-1993 standards. And because of that, as you might imagine, there's not a ton of room for graphics and sound. By this point, for the rare Master System title that was still being released, 4 megabits was standard even for that system. So it's pretty crazy to think that 16-bit titles were still being released that were that small. As a result, when playing Championship Bowling, there's times when it definitely feels bare bones. Not necessarily like a budget title, because certain things like the actual lane graphics engine that's used for when you move your bowler's starting point left to right, or the bowling physics engine as previously described, are well thought out and look and feel professional. But a title that definitely could have been doubled in size to add more to it. More lanes, more bowlers, the aforementioned lack of a save system, better audience graphics that aren't just the same animation doubled horizontally, etc. Well, now that I mention all that, maybe it was a budget title, but more in the sense that it was a low budget title versus crap shovelware designed just to sell for cheap in stores. Because of all that, the in-game graphics are pretty simple and nothing that will blow anyone away. But they're not bad, just simple. Each of the bowlers is well drawn, and I do like the aforementioned palette swapping on characters depending on what alley you're at. The audiences could definitely look better. I think they each only have like 2 frames of animation, and as I mentioned, they took the quick way out and simply doubled the screen, so it's the same set of fans twice. The game is relatively colorful, and small things like the way the pins animate after being knocked down are nice touches that show there was care involved. The music and sound unfortunately is a bit rougher, and as we've seen before on Zilog and Moto, if there is a choice between spending time on the graphics versus sound, it's always graphics. The music isn't terrible for the most part, just repetitive. However, I have to call out the track for the second alley. I don't know if they just weren't paying attention or what, but there's a super annoying low note that plays almost the entire song, sort of like a drone, and you wouldn't be faulted for muting the game during those matches. The game doesn't have that many sound effects, but the ones it has are fine, and sound bowling alley-esque. All in all, I had a lot of fun playing Championship Bowling, and regardless of any of the game's shortcomings, that's always the main goal. It's far from a perfect game, as I've laid out, but I would have liked to have seen a sequel that had more of everything while retaining the game's core gameplay. Because of that, and because of its multiplayer possibilities, I'm giving Championship Bowling 3 stars. That's probably a bit high considering the music situation, and if you really care about that sort of thing, feel free to knock it down to a 2. But it wasn't bad enough to keep me from being entertained. And that was Championship Bowling for the Genesis. I could definitely see myself pulling this one back out one of these days and playing it just for fun, and that's always a sign of a good game. There's other titles I've played for the channel that have gotten good ratings and are technically proud achievements by the developers, but I don't feel bad about letting them sit while I plow through Saints Row 2 again. Tune in next week when I stick with the Genesis and turn the Wayback Machine back all the way back to the beginning and explore 16-bit beast mode long before Marshawn Lynch and his Skittles hit the scene. Yeah, you know what game is coming. The question is, just how well is it held up 31 years later? Remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.